this episode, we turn to a reality that surprises many new learners once they start thinking about artificial intelligence, AI, governance in the real world. Most organizations will not build every important AI system themselves. They will buy tools, subscribe to services, license models, connect outside platforms, or allow employees to use vendor products that already exist. That means a large share of AI risk arrives through third-party relationships, where the organization depends on someone else's technology but still remains responsible for how that technology is selected, introduced, and used. Managing third-party AI risk, therefore, is not just about distrusting vendors or slowing down procurement. It is about understanding shared responsibility, checking whether a tool fits the intended purpose, using contracts to turn promises into obligations, involving procurement early enough to matter, and creating acceptable use rules so employees do not turn a seemingly helpful outside tool into a privacy, security, legal, or fairness problem inside the business. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is the idea that third-party AI risk is not the same as ordinary software risk, even though there is some overlap. When an organization adopts an outside AI tool, it is not only buying functionality. It is also inheriting assumptions about data, model behavior, update practices, documentation quality, and the vendor's own governance maturity. The organization may not control how the model was trained, how limitations were documented, or how quickly the tool may change after purchase. Yet it can still face the consequences if employees misuse the system or if the system affects customers, workers, or important decisions badly. That is why third-party AI risk should never be reduced to a simple question about whether the vendor is reputable. A well-known provider can still offer a tool that is poorly matched to the use case. And a tool that works well in one context can become risky in another when the deploying organization fails to examine how the product will actually operate in its own environment. It also helps to broaden what counts as third-party AI. Beginners sometimes imagine only a major external platform that the whole company formally buys, but third-party risk can enter in smaller and less visible ways too. A business unit may sign up for a cloud-based writing assistant. A development team may rely on an outside code generation service. A hiring group may pilot a screening tool from a vendor, or an employee may use a public chatbot to help with daily work. In each case, someone outside the organization is providing part of the AI capability, which means the company does not fully control how the system works behind the scenes. This matters because third-party AI risk often slips in through convenience rather than through a grand strategy decision. If governance focuses only on large purchases and ignores smaller subscriptions, pilot projects, and employee adoption of external tools, the organization may end up with a wide AI footprint long before leadership realizes how much outside technology is already touching internal data, workflows, or judgment. The first major control for managing this kind of risk is assessment, and an assessment is best understood as a structured review before the organization commits to using the tool. A good assessment does not begin by asking whether the product demonstration looked impressive. It begins by asking what business problem the organization is trying to solve, why this tool is being considered, who will be affected, and how serious the consequences would be if the tool performs poorly. That matters because a low-impact productivity assistant and a system influencing hiring, benefits, fraud review, or customer treatment should not be assessed with the same level of scrutiny. The assessment should also ask whether AI is actually needed for the use case at all, because organizations sometimes pursue outside AI tools simply because they are fashionable rather than because they are proportionate, necessary, or well-matched to the underlying problem. Strong assessments create discipline by forcing the organization to define the use case clearly before vendor excitement turns into deployment momentum. A mature assessment also looks carefully at what the vendor says the tool can do and, just as importantly, what evidence supports those claims. Marketing language often emphasizes speed, intelligence, safety, and responsible design, but governance requires a more careful ear. The organization should want to understand how the system was evaluated, what kinds of limits are known, what environments it was designed for, and where performance may become unreliable or uneven. A helpful habit for beginners is to stop hearing vendor claims as proof and start hearing them as proposals that still need review. If a provider says the tool improves decision quality, reduces bias, protects privacy, or works across many contexts, the next question should be how the vendor knows that and what assumptions sit behind the claim. This does not mean every vendor is being deceptive. It means outside tools must be assessed with enough seriousness that the organization can separate useful capability from overconfident messaging, because the business that deploys the tool will bear the real-world consequences of misplaced trust. Data, privacy, and security questions belong inside the assessment stage from the very beginning. An outside AI tool may process customer information, employee information, confidential business material, source code, contracts, or other sensitive content, and the organization needs to know exactly what will happen when that information enters the system. It is not enough to ask whether the vendor has a security page or whether the interface looks professional. The assessment should examine what data types may be entered, whether the vendor keeps prompts or outputs, whether the information may be reused for model improvement, how access is controlled, how retention works, and what happens if the provider relies on other outside services behind the scenes. These questions matter even for tools that seem low stakes, because seemingly harmless uses can drift quickly into sensitive territory once employees begin using the tool for real work. A strong assessment therefore treats privacy and security as operating questions tied to actual workflows, not as generic yes or no boxes checked after the business team has already decided that adoption is inevitable. Procurement has a major role here, and beginners should understand procurement as the part of the organization that helps structure how tools and services are evaluated, purchased, and approved. In weaker environments, procurement shows up only after the business has already chosen the vendor, which turns the process into paperwork around a decision that is basically finished. In stronger environments, procurement is involved early enough to help the organization compare options, apply consistent review standards, and make sure the right control functions are brought in before the tool becomes a foregone conclusion. This matters because third-party AI risk is not only about the technology itself. It is also about how the organization buys, documents, and governs the relationship. Procurement can help surface whether the tool fits approved categories, whether a higher-risk use case requires deeper review, and whether the vendor's answers have actually been collected and evaluated in a disciplined way. A good procurement process also asks broader questions than price, features, and delivery speed. It should examine whether the vendor's governance appears mature, whether the provider can explain the intended use and limits of the tool clearly, whether support and update practices are understandable, and whether the tool depends on other outside parties that could introduce additional uncertainty. The organization should also care about practical questions such as whether the tool can be configured safely, whether logging or monitoring is available, whether users can be segmented by role, and whether the product can be restricted to approved uses rather than spreading across the business without control. These questions are not there to make procurement painfully slow. They are there to prevent the organization from buying something it does not really understand. A vendor relationship is not only a commercial decision. It is a governance decision because the purchase commits the organization to a technology, a provider, and a set of assumptions that may shape operations long after the contract is signed and the original excitement of adoption has faded. Contracts are the next major control, and a contract is far more than a billing document or a simple permission slip to use the tool. In third-party AI governance, the contract is the place where the organization tries to turn important expectations into enforceable obligations. If the assessment revealed that data must not be reused for model training, that retention must be limited, that certain notifications are required when incidents occur, or that the vendor must provide information about updates that materially change system behavior, those points should be reflected in the agreement rather than left as verbal understandings or marketing impressions. Contracts can also address confidentiality, access rights, service commitments, intellectual property treatment, support expectations, and the responsibilities each side carries if the tool fails or creates serious concern. A beginner should hear this clearly. If a risk matters enough to discuss during evaluation, it often matters enough to address in the contract. Otherwise, the organization may discover after deployment that what it thought was promised was never actually secured in writing. At the same time, contracts are important but not magical, and this is another place where new learners need a realistic mindset. A strong contract can improve leverage, clarify expectations, and reduce ambiguity, but it cannot transform a bad use case into a good one or make a poorly governed deployment suddenly safe. If the organization buys a tool that is wrong for the context, fails to train users, ignores monitoring, or allows employees to rely on outputs beyond approved limits, a good contract alone will not prevent harm. Contracts work best when they sit inside a wider governance model that includes assessment, procurement, technical controls, internal policies, and ongoing review. They are part of the system of risk management, not the whole system. This matters because some teams are tempted to treat vendor paper as the main source of safety, especially when business pressure is high and the product looks attractive. The wiser approach is to see the contract as one strong layer among several, useful because it gives the organization rights and protections, but never enough to replace disciplined operational judgment. That is where acceptable use becomes so important. Acceptable use rules tell internal employees and teams what they may do with the third-party AI tool, what they must not do, what types of information are restricted, and when human review is mandatory before the output can influence real action. Many organizations focus heavily on vendor review and then forget that ordinary users create much of the daily risk. An approved tool can still become harmful if staff begin entering sensitive material, using the system for new purposes, trusting generated answers too easily, or applying the outputs to decisions that were never evaluated during assessment. Acceptable use rules help stop this drift by translating governance into everyday behavior. They can clarify that one tool is approved only for limited drafting support, that another must never be used with personal or confidential information, or that certain outputs must always be reviewed by a qualified human before they affect customers, employees, finances, or safety-related choices. Without acceptable use, approval at the vendor level can collapse into confusion at the user level. Acceptable use also matters because third-party AI tools often feel deceptively easy to adopt. The interface may look friendly, the outputs may sound polished, and the barrier to everyday use may be very low, which encourages overtrust and quiet expansion. A worker may begin by using the tool for rough ideas and soon rely on it for summaries of sensitive meetings, draft legal text, performance comments, or recommendations tied to real decisions. That kind of expansion does not always feel dramatic in the moment, which is exactly why clear internal rules are needed. A strong acceptable use framework explains not only what is forbidden, but also why certain uses are more sensitive and what kinds of judgment users still need to exercise. It reminds people that an outside tool can sound authoritative without being correct, and it tells them where to escalate questions when the boundaries are unclear. The goal is not to frighten employees away from every outside system. It is to make sure convenience does not quietly outrun governance, because that is how many third-party AI problems first take shape inside ordinary business activity. Managing third-party risk also requires attention after the contract is signed and the tool is in use. Vendor systems can change through model updates, new features, altered terms, broader integrations, or shifts in how the provider handles data and monitoring. A tool approved for one narrow use can become something materially different over time, and the organization needs a way to notice that rather than assuming the original assessment remains forever accurate. Ongoing monitoring should therefore look at complaints, unexpected outputs, user behavior, incident patterns, update notices, and signs that the tool is being used outside its approved purpose. The organization should also know who has authority to pause or restrict the tool if concerns emerge, and how it would exit the relationship if the provider's practices no longer fit the company's needs or obligations. Third-party AI governance is strongest when it treats vendor adoption as a continuing relationship rather than a one-time buying event. Real accountability requires memory, review, and the willingness to revisit earlier decisions when the tool, the provider, or the business context changes in meaningful ways. There are a few common mistakes that are worth correcting clearly. One mistake is assuming that well-known vendors automatically create low risk when in reality, even respected providers can be a poor fit for a specific use case or a weak match for the organization's control expectations. Another mistake is thinking procurement and legal alone can handle third-party AI risk, even though privacy, security, technical teams, business owners, and actual users all shape the safety of deployment. A third mistake is approving a tool for one purpose and then failing to notice that teams are using it for something much more sensitive. Yet another is believing that if a contract looks solid, the organization can stop worrying about user behavior, monitoring, or change control. These mistakes happen because outside tools feel easier than building internally, but governance does not disappear just because the technology came from someone else. In some ways, the need for discipline becomes greater because the organization is relying on capabilities it did not create and cannot fully inspect on its own. As you finish this lesson, the main idea to carry forward is that third-party AI risk must be managed as a full governance problem, not as a narrow vendor paperwork exercise. Assessments help the organization decide whether the tool fits the use case and the level of risk. Procurement helps bring discipline, consistency, and timing to the decision before the vendor becomes a done deal. Contracts help turn important promises about data, responsibility, support, and limits into obligations that can actually be enforced. Acceptable use keeps the organization honest after adoption by telling employees how the tool may be used, where the boundaries are, and when human judgment still has to lead. When those pieces work together, an organization is far less likely to confuse outside innovation with outsourced accountability. That is the heart of third-party AI governance. You can buy the capability from someone else, but you still have to govern the way it enters your environment, shapes your work, and affects the people who depend on your judgment.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.